Now, as a first step on that updated event, I will set the ID to the event ID that we received here, that we got out of the path. Because of course now we're not creating a new event, so now the ID should not be generated on the server. Instead, we already have an ID, an existing event ID. So we should use that. And we know that this is a valid ID because we looked for an event with that ID in an earlier step. But now that we got this ID populated as well, it's time to update this in the database. And for that, I'll go to my models package. And there we can now add a function called update. To be precise, it should be a method executed on the event, and therefore I'll get my event here as a receiver argument. Doesn't matter if it's a pointer or not. And the SQL query that should be executed here is again a query that will span multiple lines, hence I'll use these backticks. Because here I now want to execute the update statement and update the events table by setting some fields in a specific column that is identified by a where clause to new values. Now I'll come back to set in a second. I'll start with where and look for an event where ID is equal to question mark. So that's one value which will populate later, but it's not the only value. Instead, for that row that is identified by this where clause, I now want to set the name to a new value that will be injected later. I want to set the description to a new value, the location to a new value, and the date time to a new value. And now, again for efficiency purposes, we can again prepare this statement so that we get this prepared statement or an error as a response. If it's an error here, I'll simply return that error. So the return type of update is error. But if we make it past this if check, we have a prepared statement. And then here, we must make sure that we also close it. So I will call close and defer that like this. And then we can also execute this prepared statement with the exec method. And now we have to provide the actual values for those question marks in the same order. So starting with the name, then the description, then the location, then the date time, and then last the ID. So here it's event.name from that event struct on which we call update. Then event description, event location, event date time, and last but not least, event ID. And then here at the end, I want to return an error that could be generated by this exec method. If something goes wrong here, this will return an error. It will actually not just return an error, but also a result, but I don't care about the result here, so I will use this underscore. And then, as mentioned, return that error, which is either nil if everything worked, or the actual error that was generated if something went wrong. With that, we have the update method, and we can now go back to the events.go file here in this update event function. And there at the very end of this function, we can now use this updated event to call this update method like this. And that, of course, as you just saw, may yield an error. So we should also deal with that if we got an error and send back an error response if something went wrong. So I will copy this error response here where I send an internal server error status code. And that's what I'll use here as well. And update the message to could not update event. And then here, after this if check, we know that everything worked. So here I want to send back a success response with the OK status code. And then we can generate such a map here with this H alias, this type alias provided by Jin, where we have a message key which holds a message of event updated successfully. And that's now this update event request handler. In the routes go file, we can now assign this handler to this put route here. And with that, we should have everything that's needed to handle update requests. So now again, if we run this application, we can, as a first step, maybe get all events to see which events could be updated. And in my case, that's only one event. So why don't we add a second one? Add a second event that we call test event 2 with a description of another test event. And then we send this request so that now if we get all events, we actually have 2. And now let's say we want to update the one with ID 1. And I added multiple events so that we see that really only that event will be affected. So let's say we want to update this event. For this, we can add a new file here in the API test folder. Update event sounds like a fitting name. And in that file, I now want to send a put request to HTTP localhost 8080/events/ the ID of the event that should be updated. So 1 in this case here, that's the ID I'm using in the path. And then here we again need to attach some extra data. For example, the content type header, which is set to application JSON to make it clear that we're sending some JSON data along. And then separated by a blank line, the new event data that we want to store. So a new name, for example, updated test event. Then the updated description, test event, so the same text as before, because that's also valid. The location, test location, updated. And then last but not least, the date time here. And here I'll just copy the date time I sent before, so that I don't have to type this again. So with that, we're now trying to update the event with ID 1, and we should see these new values once we did that. So if I send this request, we get back a success response. That's looking good. If I, for example, target an invalid ID, I would get back an error response instead. If I omit an important field, I would also get an error response. So that's all good. And therefore, now that we did update this event, if we get all events again here, we can see that this event here with the ID 1 was indeed updated, as you can tell by these new values. So that works. As a next step, we'll make sure that we can also delete events.